performers in terms of RSMR for AMI and those that were low performers. We dug deeply using qualitative methods to understand and differentiate those hospitals, and then we tested those hypotheses in a nationally representative sample of US hospitals. We ultimately identified strategies that were being used in these high-performing hospitals. One of the sort of major points was that not only do the sort of policies and practices and technologies matter in care, but really so does the organizational context or organizational culture. So establishing that, really the next challenge was, can we change organizational culture? Can you move organizations in key aspects of the way of working in order to improve patient outcomes? So it's sort of audacious study, the first prospective intervention to change to attempt to change organizational culture and influence a hard outcome, so patient mortality rates. Let's see, we worked in 10 US hospitals through the Mayo Clinic Care Network in the US. We were looking at 3 levels of outcomes. One was just simply the uptake of those evidence-based strategies that I mentioned. The second was changes in key dimensions of organizational culture. So were they taking up the strategies? Were they changing the way they worked? And in fact, did RSMRs change? We used mixed methods because it really was the only way to both understand measuring change and to understand and describe the process. Oh, here's on the sample. I'll say just working through the Mayo Clinic Care Network, we identified 10 intervention hospitals across the US. Each hospital built a guiding coalition. This is maybe familiar to some or many of you through IHI's work and Don Berwick's and Cotter's and a number of organizational change experts who talk about guiding coalitions that are multidisciplinary. I don't want to be pointing. That work across departments and within and outside the hospital. So because we were looking at 30-day mortality rates, the pre-hospital piece was critical. So we needed to engage pre-hospital EMS as well as the discharge. And so we were working with post-hospital planners as well. And importantly, these guiding coalitions worked across all levels of the organization. We were really intervening to influence things like power and hierarchy, psychological safety, building on Amy Edmonds' work and others. And so these guiding coalitions engaged in the intervention. It was over our 2-year period. We convened 4 key representatives of the guiding coalitions. I can talk in more detail, but I'm really trying to make myself go fast. But the 10 hospitals, 4 representatives from each, so it was a convening of 40 people 3 times over the study period. The most intensive work occurred on site, so we had facilitators running workshops on site in the hospitals. For those of you doing D&I work, many of you, I'm sure you're very facile at recognizing the need to be very accommodating when we're in clinical spaces. And so some of these workshops were, 6 in the morning, all day on a Saturday, but intensive work with the guiding coalitions on site 4 times over the intervention period. We had a remote support, sort of collaborative information sharing kind of platform, which was a total tank, total bomb. So true confessions, and we're writing about that now. Like, how did that happen? We had these Yale undergrads. They all are so entrepreneurial, and they come to us and they'll do like consultations. And so this group of these whiz kids said, we'll tell you the best platform to use for this community, this purpose, and flopped. So we're trying to learn why. On the research side, we did surveys. So the quantitative surveys were done at 3 time points, and then intensive interviews and observations. So this dream that you all live as well, tons and tons of data. How did it fit together? The qualitative data were over 3 waves of the intervention. These were the ends across each wave, and then 56 observations across all the sites. The surveys, again, each wave. Really high response rates because we're really careful with our survey burden issue, measurement burden. Jody's thing, we're very parsimonious, do lots of piloting. I'm learning that many of you do that as well. And then merging those to both, understand what changed and how it changed. Okay, so that's all the giant backdrop. And I know I went through it quickly, but is there some glaring omission or something that makes no sense? Something I should clarify before we go on to really talk about the methods in this broader context. Okay, pardon. Size of the team. Which team? Okay. We had 2 components to the team. bright line between them. There were facilitators that ran the workshops. There were 9 of them from around the country, our various collaborators, expert in organizational leadership and capacity development. And then we had a research team that I think was probably 10 to 12-ish people, not all full FTEs on it, including clinicians. So we had an interventional cardiologist, awesome qualitative researcher, did some of the site, but not all. So sort of flexible in that way. And then I was the PI. So moving into the project and taking on those challenges, which I hope were sort of representative of the challenges that you're, experiencing or anticipating as you dip your toe into this work. So that's how the structure of the talk is working. On this issue of building and managing the team, it's so essential to include competence, to be very clear within teams about who's doing what and why you've brought them to the team. So we talk about the management of teams in this paper in the Journal of Mixed Methods Research. David Berg is a colleague at Yale. He is faculty for much of our leadership development work that we do globally, and has really taught us a lot about how groups work. Regina knows David well. He has taught us about the importance of defining roles within groups and tending to group dynamics, and really tending on an ongoing basis to these dynamics throughout the project. And so here I think just a highlight to say that there are strategies, there are ways of thinking about managing these teams that are more or less effective. Of course, you need to sort of adopt them and make them your own, but addressing issues of skepticism, power in the room, the biostatistician v. the qualitative researcher, what does that look like? Or the social scientist v. the cardiologist, what does that look like? How does this play out in teams? Common dialogue, really essential, and shedding the jargon. So we talked about this yesterday, or last night at our lovely dinner. Thank you. That was a really nice restaurant. We were talking about response letters, like how painful those are, or response to grants, and how I shared one experience that our team had. Such an awesome editor. I will be forever grateful to this guy, who really wanted us to get this paper through the gauntlet. This was at the Annals of Internal Medicine. And he kept coming back to us saying, Leslie, that is jargon. Or Leslie, no one's going to understand that. Or you are going to get an eye roll. Or you are going to whatever. And so he helped me identify within the manuscript a dozen terms that were just, they would have been very distancing, off-putting, ineffective in communicating the science. And as I shared last night, it's all about compromise. I kept a few of the words in there. I'm like, we're going to use saturation. We have to. But this mindfulness around, we all carry around our jargon, and so tending to that we have found has been really important. By way of a tool here, role definitions. This is what I mean by clarifying role definitions within the team. This is on data analysis in particular. So this is just an illustration of the way we think about we use multiple coder teams, but how we need to be efficient with our resources, right? And so in thinking about the sort of level of detail and the respective roles of others that may come into the project. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on this tool, only to flag for you, we talk about the particular role. So there's who's doing data management and the first coder, what are those sorts of tasks look like? What do we think about in terms of time estimate for that? Second coder, who are they and how much time do we expect them to spend? This first expert read is something that we've had to develop in our team because we're all too busy to do the work deeply, and yet we have to do it. So you need that clinical expertise. You need the cardiologist or the internist or the hospitalist in the data, but they're certainly not going to sit there with 400 pages of transcripts. It's not going to happen. So we think about ways in which you can read some or all subset of transcripts. And so this is just a general framework for thinking about what are the particular roles, and then what are the people and time needed to do those roles. And we revisit this throughout the project. Another, maybe a snoozer, but really helpful tool. I don't know, do people use Gantt charts in your planning besides just putting them in your grants? Do you actually use them? Anybody? Yeah? So that's cool. I knew I would like this place. I teach these to my undergrads and they just think, oh, really? and then they have to do one, and they understand what a useful tool they are. And when we teach management and leadership, you know, around the world, this is a tool we point to because there's lots that you can learn from it. I'm not going to perseverate because it seems like this is something you use, but only to flag for you, you're aware of the complexity of trying to integrate the data analysis with the intervention. So this sort of gets to the question around timeliness of feedback. If you're going to look at clinician buy-in and adapt the intervention accordingly, or the decision tool, how does that work? And so it's just really critical to be thinking about how things sync up throughout the course of the project and revisiting it. And this really helps for us anyway with human resource management in these large projects. Another example, audit trail. When you're writing your qualitative stuff, do you all talk about audit trails and put a citation there? Do you create audit trails? Do you use them as tools? True confession, here's a yes. So what does it look like for you, an audit trail? Yep, and what's in it? A date and what was done. And what was done in terms of data collection, analysis, whatever. Oh, the whole thing, yep. But it's hard. It is hard. Exactly. And yet, so I will say, and for those of you that do reviews of grants and manuscripts, I'm sure, you know, I expect that you look for audit trails, right? But often you're wondering what really was done with that, and did it really shape the analytic work? This is just an example of an audit trail of the kinds of stuff we keep, where we keep it, like what it's used for, and so on. These are just, again, really practical, useful tools. And when you're writing that paper and you say we managed an audit trail and we documented our decisions, you know, you've got one. I also feel like this is part of our responsibility as qualitative or mixed methodologists in the health sciences, you know, where it's still pretty new, to do a really good job about transparency. So, you know, we need to be able to feel like we can represent this work, because often it's experienced as sort of a black box by people who aren't familiar with this methodology. It feels like, oh, they talked to some people, they read the stuff, they wrote I don't know. It feels maybe mysterious. And so if we're gonna really ensure the rigor and credibility of the work, it's on us to be able to be transparent. So we're doing things like, you know, having data sets that are available. They're, you know, we always use software now. When I first started to do this work, we had like colored highlighters. Painful. But, you know, the data sets are available, and these decision memos are available. So just a pitch for audit trails. Same thing on code structures. This is not new. I'm gonna not spend much time on this, but to the point about like trying to remember what you decided and when, for us, we're a little compulsive about that. So this is just an example from a code structure where we had things we wanted to go back and discuss as a full group, and where we have some examples, and where we're thinking, okay, that's how we use that particular code, maybe how we merged it or thought about it in relation to another code. So these kinds of trackers can be really useful as you're trying to go back and sort of recreate the process of analysis. Okay. Any questions before we move off sort of team composition, management issues in these data sets? Anything from your experience you've used that's been really useful to you in your groups and your projects that you want to add in? Did you have just one person managing the manager of all that? Yes. So that's Emily Churlin, bless her. Because we have found, so it's a good question, because we have found, we split it in one project, that was a disaster. They have had transcripts from half the sample, the other had transcripts from the other half the sample. That was before Atlas. We use Atlas, they're really all the same, but the HUs didn't merge. I mean, there could be really messy things that happen when you try to split. You think, okay, we're gonna reduce the burden, but we tag one person with it now, yeah. What's your experience? Do you spread it across, or one person? Yeah. 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 Yes, right? Yeah. Yeah. I think absolutely. Especially with these complex data sets, and you're going to have to track things. That person knows, they know it, and you can go to them and they're sort of like embedded here. Yeah. Yes, please. Excellent. I wonder if I could just jump to that slide. I'm going to. Well, it's pretty far away. I'll come to it. Okay. I'll get there. It's a really important question. I think it's the difference between really successful high impact projects and flops. I mean, I think it's like almost a linchpin. Let's see, on sampling and data collection, maybe just a flag for us, these came up from a recent set of reviews on papers we did, where we were asked what were the recurrent people in each wave. Like, did you go back? You saw in this LSL study we had 3 waves of qualitative interviews and the ends were different the whole time. Well, they were different for a reason, because we were doing random, a purposeful approach in each wave so that we were looking for people who were related, I'll show you an example in a second, to the phenomenon of interest and working in the coalition at that time. In this, we talked this morning with the team about the unit of analysis being, with you guys, being the, no, it was before you, it was a Mandy. Sorry, I'm getting delirious. Somebody just like take me away if I really start to lose it, Georgina. Take me to the hallway. We talked about the unit of analysis. They were concerned that in their project they had only had, for instance, they were looking at surgical site infections. They only had 2 surgeons, 1 surgical nurse, 1 kind of a tech or something, and that they didn't have large, they didn't have large samples. Was you joking? And to saturate in each of those, and we talked through it and clarified that's really not the unit of analysis they were talking about. They weren't going to do comparative analysis of surgeons v. techs. They were really looking at the unit within each hospital, and so just being really clear about saturation and the unit. In these multiple longitudinal studies, retention is not always a goal. I'll explain why in a moment. I would say something, and I'm interested in your experience in this, because I'm starting to really feel we do a lot of, we have a lot of shared interests and do similar kinds of work as your teams here. What you think about matching interview expertise of the interviewer to the respondent. I'm not gonna, first I'll ask you and then I'll share our experience. But when you're thinking about these large studies in clinical settings, you've got a team, do you think about matching of respondents, and particularly relative to clinician-based research? And if so, how do you manage that? How do you handle that? You don't really think about it? Or please.
I mean, we had one time when we couldn't do it. It didn't work out that well. So I think at least some kind of base on it.
Yeah, couldn't do it. Can you explain? So you sent maybe an MPHer who has an interest in Spanish, so it was language issue, right. Communication, or cultural. Yes, yeah. Got you. Your specific study. Yeah, yeah, please. Yeah. Yep. Oh, really? Wow. So in that instance, so the PI did the data collection in one place, and in the other it was the PRAs and the staff. Yeah. So fascinating example. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's a great question, and that is the crux of the issue here, right? So I think there's no right answer in a way, but there are some things you can do. And Megan, please always just chime in, because you know this is a community here and a collaboration, and we'll all come out better if we can learn from each other during our bit of time together. So this is a challenge, right? And so most of our work is in cardiology, and we've, over the years and through experience, come to appreciate that in certain instances, it is absolutely essential to match on clinical expertise, and in others, not so much. And so we kind of give ourselves room on that. So I'll be more specific. In hospital-based interviews where we're interviewing, for example, interventional cardiologists, those interviews can only be done by another interventional cardiologist for the questions we're trying to answer, for a whole bunch of reasons we could get into maybe at another time, but we recognized that, and we were fortunate enough to have somebody that we could bring and match. And so there we invest tremendous resources, because that interview is only valuable if you're going to elicit authentic information. Surgeons, same thing. So there are some instances where it feels like, for us, it's like a deal breaker, and we've got to get someone who can both understand and relate to that person in an effective way. But in general, otherwise, we just invest in really good interviewers. So there's not much methodological guidance in this area. Somebody should do this if anybody has spare time. I have a sense nobody around here has any spare time, but you're all very busy. But there's mixed evidence around concordance of interviewer and respondent. And some of the early literature was like, well, it's really, you've got to match on gender and race and all these things. And then the more recent little bit of literature was like, no, it's really irrelevant. You just have to have a good interviewer. And so if you have a well-trained interviewer, that person should be able to elicit information that is like authentically represents the respondent's voice. If you get deep into the weeds and clinical issues, that's not really a qualitative topic. So typically you wouldn't be talking about the like microness of some little clinical issue necessarily. That's a good question. Please.
We had a situation working with interventional cardiologists, and we were asking questions about the appropriate use criteria during a seizure.
Yes. Yeah.
And we started the interview, and we were all over the phone, and we had a good researcher, but she was not a cardiologist, started asking questions, and the cardiologist literally got so up there. He asked these questions, and he hung up on her. And so for our future, because we did not have the staff, and at that point we had already started. So what we ended up doing was saying to the cardiologist right at the start,
yeah,
we are not cardiologists.
Yes.
We are not questioning what you're doing. We're just trying
Yes.
to find out what you are doing. So please
Yes.
don't misunderstand our question or anything other than we're just trying to find out. And if you have questions for us, we have a cardiologist who. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, that's the other piece. And I would add just a bit to that. So one is being really transparent. I'm not a cardiologist, but the other is owning what you are, right? So it's the sense of humility and confidence blended. So I'm not a cardiologist, but I am an expert qualitative researcher. We're doing this project funded by PCORI. Our goal is to do this, that, and the other thing, and my role in this project is to do data collect something. So it's like, you know, expressing, conveying whatever confidence that you are good at what you're doing. You're the best person to be doing that particular thing. All right, and then lastly, this is sort of like the comment of the clinician buy-in and feeding it into the tool is just making sure that the data collection strategy is refined based on prior findings. And so this is about sort of churning the data quickly and having the sampling and data collection being really very interdependent. This is just to show, I was sort of flagging that retention is not always a goal. You want a key informant, but longitudinally that person may be different if you're doing any kind of design. In this coalition, so there's one hospital where you see across the waves, we had, I don't know how many are yellow there, but like maybe 10 of them were the same, exact same people along the way. And so we were able to capture their lived experience over time. But that in this hospital, the coalition changed over time. This ended up being a high-performing coalition, and we wrote a paper about this. It's fascinating because we always think churn is a bad thing. In this instance, it really kept the coalition alive and relevant and thriving. But then you'll see there were new added in each wave. So we want to shed some of our assumptions that we hold on to tight when we're thinking about quantitative longitudinal data. They're not always applicable on the qualitative side. Okay. Okay, so this is to the question about coding and getting expert input into the analysis efficiently and things like that. So we've worked hard over the years to be efficient in coding these large data sets and trying to figure out strategies for moving quickly through the data, even as we're feeling really comfortable that we've learned all we possibly can learn. So, you know, just to flag that we just really want to be mindful not to be too focused on efficiency, like at the risk of developing rigorous data, but we also need to pay attention to it. So this paper is an old one now, but we proposed, this is by Betsy Bradley and myself and Kelly Devers, an approach that drew on a variety of approaches to coding, that at that time there were sort of two ways you could do coding. It could be wholly grounded theory. So we're doing line by line, we're reading, nothing a priori, nothing comes to the codes, we're reading in the transcripts, all of that, you know, roots in phenomenology. Over to this other side, which is just like, well, we've got the outline and we're just gonna populate it. You know, kind of very pragmatic kind of approach to, we're coming with our framework. We know we're testing this re-aim thing and we're gonna get the framework over here and we're gonna code with that. And we found really neither one of those very satisfying. I think we believe that nothing really, you can't come without any assumptions to anything you do. And so coming with a blank slate, truly a priori, no assumptions doesn't feel right. Or really true to us. And so, and yet the beauty, if you're all the way over here on sort of the structure, you lose any of the gain from the qualitative piece. So this paper just enumerates a pragmatic approach, one that's both, where you have a framework, and for much of your work, you're being guided by some D&I theory or some set of literature, so you're coming to it with questions. So you build a framework for coding, even as you're very deliberate and explicit and mindful about populating it or moving it around or shedding things or adding things. And so it's a sort of a hybrid approach. And we describe that in this paper. Around the efficient coding process, this is just an example of sort of our goals, how we think about the purpose of building a coding team. This was for the longitudinal analysis in this study, where, you know, sort of what would our goals be? How can we actually move through this morass of data and produce a concise synthesis of the essential learnings that is then suited for publication? Well, it's like no easy task. And I don't think there isn't any one right way that I know of, but here just, I think it's for us, it's always this deliberate thoughtfulness about like where we're trying to go and how do we get there and feel good about the path that we take. So here, our purpose of this team, building this team, was to make sure that we had more than one person coding each transcript. Now, mind you, this was, I don't know if there were 500 interviews maybe, I think it was 10,000 pages of data or something. Whatever, it's blocked from my mind. Pardon? How many coders? 8 to 10-ish. So we wanted to be sure that we had teams so that we were doing multiple coders for each transcript. We wanted to create teams that had high-level coders and people doing line by line. I'll explain that in a minute. This was especially important for round 1. Well, maybe I'll just explain it now. No, I won't. So that's a principle, right? So we wanted high-level input and people going from a grounded way. And we wanted to have continuity if possible. So meaning we wanted to have coders working on the transcripts from the places they knew, because many of them had also done observations. And they also were on site for 3 or 4 days at a time, multiple times, and had some sort of gestalt understanding of the organization as well. We wanted to leverage that. And we, tried to assign coders to the same hospitals across all 3 rounds. So there were sort of experts on certain hospitals. Those were all the things we were trying to juggle with this giant matrix of then how we slot people. And the team figured this out. I did not, and probably couldn't replicate it. But they described a process for round 1 that we don't need to go into the minutiae here. But the point with the high-level coders for each hospital was that we assigned the PI and other experts, so nurse, cardiologist, QI expert, social worker, people that we wanted to have their disciplinary lens in the data, we assigned them roles in this process, which is this. So here we have the core methods teams experts. These are the people that are churning through all the data. They're doing it in teams. They're doing it so they're matched and meeting those principles that I just described through the entire data set. But then our content experts dip in at only like critical decision junctures or analytic junctures. And this really came from the very friendly, honest pushback from our clinicians, which are like, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to learn Atlas, and I'm not going to code a document. Well, they don't have time. And yet we didn't want to lose that input. And so this is as basic as sending them. So initially here, content experts inform the initial codes, sending them the code structure, which in our sort of approach is never more than 1.5 pages ever. If it's longer than that, it needs to be reworked. And so initial sort of face validity, what makes sense? Does this cohere with your experience or experience of like others? Something missing? So just very high level input at the very first building of the code structure. Then we did have content experts on these site visits. So for those hospitals they visited, we wanted them to layer in codes as well, because again, we're really trying, this was, if we could have done a dream study, we would have had ethnographers in these sites for the whole 2 years, but we didn't. And so we were trying to kind of recreate that mastery of context to the extent we could. And so the content experts were also looking at the ones that they attended. And then lastly, the final code structure. And so this is a way just to be thinking about having people lay eyes on the data, but not being down in the weeds of the actual transcripts. And our code structures, I didn't put one in here, but our code structures are, they have certain properties that we find useful, and I think you guys do too, because somebody in this last 24 hours was describing theirs to me, and I was like, that sounds awesome. But I can't remember who that was. So the code structures are as they would appear, right? Normally the core properties are that they're hierarchical, there's large conceptual domains, there may be subdomains that attach to that. There are utterances from participants that might be particularly salient. This concept of racial fatigue was something that one of our clinical scholars developed, and that's a classic, I think, example of using respondent elicitation to really nail a construct. We're paying attention to all of those sort of language things at the same time as the code structure is operational. So it has within it a definition. By this racial fatigue, we mean this thing. And it has illustrative quotes. When we use this code, we use it in this way. And it has decision rules. When we use this code, we never use this code, or whatever, or we always use this code. And so when you have a code structure like that, it really is the essence of your data. Like those are your findings. And so having people lay eyes on those, if they're as rich as that, can be really, really useful. It's not just sort of a token like running an eye over. You can really have substantive input about the emerging theories and the way that the data are sort of taking shape as you're moving through the data set. So I don't know if that answers your question. So it may be, you might imagine this would take a content expert maybe 4 hours altogether, if they were weighing in maybe at each of these points, maybe 6 hours. So it's a really, I think we have found it to be a really useful way not to lose them. Yeah. Yeah, so this gets to managing the team in that maybe it's a long article and probably better as a sleep aid than anything. But that first one in JMMR talks about this issue of bias and the way the group functions. And so we're really, really careful about encouraging criticism and pushback in the team. And so we would have all manner of people working in the team. This expert comes in and says, well, I see this. Or they track in the document, this is BS, it doesn't work this way, it's like this. There needs to be space within that, team for consensus building. So what do you mean by that? Give me an example by that. Can we look in the data? Are there disconforming data? And so lots of, and that's the richness of the diversity in the team. Like that's how you leverage that is to take that clinical bias and drop it in there and then go, okay, does this fit? Does it work? And that really does require time, negotiation, building a team that there can be candor and pushback in the team, but it's really important both to get it and to push back on it. Yeah, that's a really good question. All right, anything else on this kind of big picture strategy? Okay, all right, assessing change, only a couple of sort of tools and techniques here. There is a book by Saldana. I don't know, what's his first name? Charles? Johnny Saldana. I don't know the name of the book, but maybe it's called Longitudinal Data Analysis, something. It's about longitudinal data analysis, so I don't know the name of it, but I will send you the thing. So he's written lots about this. We broke it down, very pragmatic. Again, our team is, we're health services researchers that just want to get this stuff published in the best journal we can, and we do not want to just sort of linger in the data for decades. It's like that's whatever. So moving along, there are many ways to look at change over time. These are some key points that Saldana makes that I do think are useful, and some of them are our tips. So we use a change code in our code structure. Do people use that technique? And what does it look like? How do you do it? Use it? Does anybody? No? Okay. So for us, it's just a code. It has a number. It can be, 22 or something, and it is used to flag where we're noticing things that appear to change. Now, respondents don't often utter like, well, this changed since last time, and you wouldn't really want them to anyway, right? We don't want their hyperbole or their kind of anecdote or their impression. We want to watch the change over time. But you can be very deliberate in looking to see. So for instance, we use this a lot with those strategies. So we're in the hospitals looking to see, are you using now EMS, are you having EMS people join the door-to-balloon meetings or whatever? And initially they're talking, no, we don't have that. And by the end they're saying, yes, they're fully embedded in the coalition. That, for example, would be something you try to tag with a change code. Another flag is to just know that we don't always know, obviously, what to look for in advance. So sort of always this openness. Change may come upon us that we don't necessarily anticipate. And sometimes changes are very, very subtle and they're impossible to capture. So for us, culture change, it was a little bit crazy, I guess, to think that we could see it in a 2-year time frame. Edgar Schein and others have talked about 10 years for culture change that's measurable. And so it may be actually that, we captured change in this study, but if we had watched longer, we would have seen even more change. Also need to be open to the fact change may not occur. And I think for this is again around efficiency, is paying attention to what you expect most people would be most likely to change. So to be specific, in these 5 strategies, one of them was around interaction with EMS. Well, these hospitals were implementing those strategies. That was the goal, right? So, well, we're going to see, did that thing change? This was an outcome we wanted to measure. Psychological safety within the coalition, the functioning group, we were intervening on that. So we're going to expect that to change. And so focusing on these things can also help you not get distracted with other noise in the data set. Last tool, and I know there's one more, and then I'll stop. We can chat a little bit more. We use these different kinds of matrices to look at change over time. You can think about looking across a code or a theme. One of the main goals of this Leadership Saves Lives intervention was to provide space for creative problem solving, and so we were really interested in looking at whether or not that changed over time, both over time within sites and across sites. You can also be thinking about site-based matrices and populating these in order to track change over time. And then lastly, code reports assessing change. So here's an example of where we had a change code. Can't see, I guess it's just, I don't see the number of the change code on here, but this is a filter where this particular quote, 400A was changed. Okay, so these are the codes that attach. You see 99A through concise great quotes. I can explain what that is. Silo thinking, all the stuff that people had attached to this particular quote, and it's tagged with a change code because this was something that they're actually, in this instance, they're actually saying now we're all able to be open and honest. This is something that changed in their experience over time. Just an illustration. Okay. I'm going to say this because it is another efficiency thing. This concise great quote for any code for papers. Does anybody wonder what that is? Do you use such a thing? Yeah. Oh, and do you call it like great quote or something? Oh, yeah. Oh, excellent. We don't have to talk about it. Okay. It's really, and there are properties of great quotes, so that's great. You're on that bus. We find it really helpful. Publication strategy, I've talked about this with teams as well. We have a book on mixed methods, Marcella Nunez-Smith, brilliant junior faculty from Yale, and it is for clinicians. It's meant to be sort of a primer around mixed methods in health sciences, and in that, we got permission from the Annals editor and from other editors to put stuff in there. So there's some, I think, hopefully useful, concrete examples of response letters and cover letters and things like that. But really important to create a plan at the outset of the project, no question. And in these plans, it helps us map the entire, anthology that will grow from these large projects. These large projects done well and with strategic thinking from the outset should produce multiple manuscripts, high impact for targeted audiences, framed for certain audiences, and represent a whole bolus of work. And so to lay that map out early on, is really, I think, crucial for us to keep focused on the end point when you can really get lost in these large projects, and revisiting the publication plan, obviously, as the data emerges. This is just something we've learned to do, publishing the methods protocol as early as possible. There are now lots of places that will do that, which is great. So BMJ Open is one, Implementation Science is one, BMCs have them. So those are great because you can take a whole giant bunch of methods stuff and put it over here in the methods paper. And then when you're trying to write in your 3,000 words, you just cite, you know, as described in, and then you're done, literally. And then you get lots more real estate for what you're trying to report in the main paper. And then investing heavily in response letters. Working hard, because this is a sort of a community collective event or experience here where you're trying to move high quality, rigorous, qualitative and mixed methods research out into journals for whom it is foreign in many instances. And so you are really working on multiple levels, right? You want to get your new science out there, but you're also trying to advance the field and move the methods forward. And so in response letters, we often, I shared yesterday, often our response letters are longer than the submission, the manuscript itself, because we're embedding it with techniques and citations and reassurances and explanations and all kinds of things. And we find that often editors are really happy to get those, and reviewers are happy to get those resources because they're like, oh, okay, this is actually a thing. It imbues some confidence, and it really does help advance the field. So just a call out to do that. That's a publication plan. I'm not gonna, it's in the slides and you can have it, because I want to stop and say thank you because we've got just a couple of minutes to go, and ask if you have any questions, anything you'd like to offer on some of these challenges, any reflections from your experience that the rest of the group and I can learn from. Anybody? Yes, please. Yes. 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 We have an awesome audio clip that I use, and you know the person I'm talking about, so I'm not going to tell you. But if you heard the clip, you would know. It happened, like in real time. So we were training this person to do qualitative interviews, and he was earnestly trying to do these interviews. And we were at somewhere, and he had to introduce himself. And of course, this person knew him, and immediately said, well, how do you do it at blank? And they went off the rails into this like competitive sort of thing. It was very bad. So we never brought him again on a trip. It's a risk. So we intervened, we're trying to train. So what we did in that moment was, we know you guys have lots to talk about offline. We're mindful of your time, and we're here to focus on blah. And he's here with his researcher hat on today. That's exactly what we said. Okay, worked maybe, I don't know, but it's important, it's a risk for sure. So you gotta weigh all that. And it may not even really matter, right? For many instances, it really may not matter. And for a researcher who says, like, I'm not this, but I am this, like, you can claim some space and it can be effective, I think. But that's a really important flag. Yeah. Yes, please. Yes. Yes. So that table that had the yellow in it, was that your question? Was there overlap or? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Actually, it was fascinating. It was like doing an interview for a book maybe or something. You sort of got to know the person. Now, there was a lot of variation. All the things that weren't highlighted in yellow were new roles that were embedded on the coalition. So there were some we met for the very first time on wave 3, but we needed them there because they were the representative for pharmacy or whatever. And we then need, so this point of that was the sampling does have to flex, but for those that are recurrent, it's incredibly rich because you go back out, you have a relationship, you read the interview ahead so that you can refer back. You talked to us last time about this frustration. Can you tell me how that's going? So it really does anchor the conversation. Yeah, do you have a different experience or a worry? Yep. Yeah. Yep. How often do you go back? And what's the interval between the interviews? Yeah. It's tricky, right? 6 months go by like this, and you're asking somebody the same thing you just asked them. So I can see why people might get testy. And how long are the interviews? Yeah, so that's also really long, right? Depending on what you're trying to learn and who you're trying to learn it from. Really, you're all good at this. You're better at this than we are at Yale, I think. Understanding respondent or patient burden for measurement. It's like one of the first things Jody said. So being mindful. Do you really know? Do you really expect change in 6 months? And on what? And how do you differentiate from the prior information sharing? And or say, okay, you talked to us last time about this. Has anything changed? Or can you tell me how things have changed? Yeah, so it should be new, but if it doesn't feel new to them, yeah, they're gonna be frustrated. Yes, all right. I think with that, we're gonna close because I was like, as promised, stopping as the chime rings. So thank you so much, appreciate it. And we're around for a few minutes. We're around for a few minutes anyway, if there's anything I can be helpful with. I'm happy to send stuff.
Thank you.
Awesome. We're good. Well, that was fun. Yeah. People shared stuff. Hi.
I'm Becky.
Oh, good to meet you. Am I going to meet you in a little while?
At the GNI meeting.
Thank you. Okay, I'll thank you.